Jesus is the reason for the season. God become one of us, the fulfillment of hundreds of prophecies, all somehow wrapped up in swaddling clothes, in the most helpless of all creatures, a human baby. One of my favorite Christmas decorations, as long as I can remember, is the Nativity scene, or the Creche. We had one of these when I was a kid that we would set up by the Christmas tree. I think my grandfather had made it or something. And I love putting this out because it was like a set of Holy Family action figures. It became doubly special to me when the old one we had fell apart and I got to build a replacement in shop class. No, well, I don't treat them like Holy Family action figures anymore. The Nativity scene is still one of my favorite Christmas decorations. I love it now because when I see it, every figure in the scene tells a part of the Christmas story. There's animals, usually sheep and cattle. And what these say to me is that God isn't afraid to be born into a mess. God isn't afraid to come into our own messes. You gotta think that this stable where the animals lived wouldn't have been clean. They would have done their business there. And God is not above being born into that kind of a mess. Which means that no matter how your heart or my heart tend to be, no matter how much we might struggle with belief and disbelief, with virtue and with sin, God is not afraid to step into that mess. God is not afraid to meet us in our own messes. The fact that an angel shows up is a reminder that sometimes we need God's help. We need supernatural help to see what we're supposed to see, to do what we're supposed to do. And God graciously sends that help to us. The fact that some people show up, but not everybody. The shepherds and the wise men show up, but the crowds don't, reminds us that Jesus was not noticed by everybody. It tells us that this is how God deals with it all the time. He doesn't force us to do anything. Doesn't even force us to believe that he's there. But when we're willing to pay attention, to listen, and to follow him, we can see some things that are truly amazing. But central to all of these figures, of course, is the Holy Family, Jesus and Mary and Joseph. Jesus is the reason for the season. God become one of us, the fulfillment of hundreds of prophecies, all somehow wrapped up in swaddling clothes, in the most helpless of all creatures, a human baby. This speaks to us not only of God's humility, but his willingness to experience everything that we do except for sin. And it also shows us that God sometimes makes himself known to us in hidden and in unexpected ways. Joseph is my favorite saint. Even though he was such an important person in Jesus' life, he's not around for a whole lot of the Gospels. In fact, there's not a single word that he spoke that's written down in Scripture for us to read. But what we see is that every time God speaks to him, every time God asks something of him, it's challenging. It demands a lot of faith. And Joseph listens. Joseph listens when God tells him to marry Mary. Joseph listens when God says that Jesus' life is in danger and they have to flee to Egypt. And then when it's time to come back again. He does so no matter what the cost is to himself because he trusts that what's being asked of him is part of a bigger story being written by the God who is love. And we're called to imitate that faith of Joseph, to learn to trust God, even when things are hard or confusing or difficult, because we too are part of this great big story that is being written by the God who is love. And then we have the Blessed Virgin Mary, Jesus' mom. Mary is the model for all Christians of what Christian living is supposed to look like. God calls her, she says yes, and then through her, Jesus comes into the world. And even though she doesn't totally understand what's going on, and even though there's a very real danger to her life because she says yes to God, she still says yes. God calls us to something similar. God calls us to say yes to him. God calls us to say yes to him, and through that yes, to bring Jesus into the world. And God calls us to say yes to him, even though sometimes we don't understand, or it might be kind of frightening or kind of scary. As we move through these weeks towards the celebration of Christmas, there's always a lot that's going on. All of the decorations and the food and the song. And I want to encourage you, I want to remind you to look at this scene, this image of the Nativity, as a starting point to think about the Christmas story. How each figure in this scene reminds us something about God, reminds us something about us, reminds us something about what God is trying to do in our lives, how God is trying to bring us to into this incredible story. And I'd also ask you to consider reading the story for yourselves, to open up the Gospels and to read what Matthew and Luke, at the beginning of the Gospels, what they narrate to us about the circumstances surrounding the birth of Jesus. The involvement of all these people, the animals, the shepherds, the wise men, the angel, and of course, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary. whose life and whose choices are at the very center of why we have a Christmas at all.